The sun over Alexandria was not a celestial body so much as a physical weight, a brassy, oppressive disk that turned the Mediterranean into a sheet of hammered lead. In the sweltering heat of August 1942, the Royal Navy docks groaned under the frantic rhythm of a world in transition. The air was a thick, suffocating soup of brine, unrefined diesel exhaust, and the omnipresent alkaline dust of the western desert. Major Alistair Sterling of the Royal Armoured Corps stood on the pier, his khaki drill tunic already stained with dark blossoms of sweat. He adjusted his beret, the silver cap badge stinging his fingers with its absorbed heat. Beside him stood Brigadier General Willoughby, a man whose military bearing seemed held together by sheer force of Victorian will and starch. They watched in a shared, heavy silence as the massive cranes of the American freighter SS Empire Kite began their slow, mechanical dance. "They look like cathedrals, Alistair," the brigadier muttered, his voice raspy from years of desert grit and Three Castles cigarettes. "Monstrously tall. Rommel's gunners will see them from Cairo." High above, suspended by thick steel cables that thrummed with tension, the first M4 broke the plane of the ship's hold. It was a slab-sided beast, coated in a dull, oily olive-drab paint that looked alien against the sun-bleached tans and sky blues of the British camouflage schemes. As the crane lowered the tank toward the quay, the sheer scale of the machine became apparent. It was not lean and low like the Crusader, nor was it the utilitarian, rivet-studded box of the Valentine. It was something else entirely, a product of a civilization that measured strength in tonnage and assembly lines rather than cavalry traditions. The tank settled onto the stone pier with a groan of its vertical volute spring suspension, the metal-to-metal contact ringing out like a funeral bell for the era of the light cruiser tank. Sterling stepped forward, his boots crunching on spilled grain and coal dust. He reached out a hand, laying his palm against the side of the hull. The steel was not cold. It throbbed with the residual heat of the ship's hold, but more than that, it felt strangely smooth. He ran his fingers along the edge of the transmission housing. "Cast steel, sir," Sterling called back, his voice tinged with a reluctant professional admiration. "The entire front end is a single piece of molded metal. No rivets to pop inwards when a solid shot hits the glacis. No jagged edges of armor plate bolted together by hand. It looks manufactured. Not built, but birthed from a machine." A small group of Royal Army Ordnance Corps engineers gathered around the tracks. They were men used to the temperamental nature of British engineering, to the cooling fans that seized in the heat and the gearboxes that shredded themselves under the strain of the Egyptian sand. They looked at the 75mm gun protruding from the rounded turret with a mixture of hope and deep-seated suspicion. "Is it true, Major?" one of the sergeants asked, looking up from the heavy rubber-padded tracks. "About the dual-purpose gun? Does it actually fire a high-explosive shell worth a damn?" "That is what the Americans claim, Sergeant," Sterling replied, walking toward the rear of the vehicle. "A gun that can knock out a Panzer at 1,000 yards and then suppress an anti-tank nest with the next breath. A luxury we haven't been afforded since we crossed the wire at Fort Capuzzo." The brigadier joined him, poking a swagger stick at the air cleaners. "The height is the devil's own luck, though. We've spent 2 years teaching our boys to hull down, to hide in every dip and depression. This Sherman stands nearly 10 feet tall. It's a target, Alistair. A magnificent, expensive target." Sterling didn't answer immediately. He was looking at the small details, the grease nipples that were easily accessible, the wide hatches that looked as though a man could actually escape through them if the world turned to fire, and the strange bulbous housing for a radio that was rumored to work even when the engine was screaming at full tilt. "The Germans have the Mark IV with the long barrel now, sir," Sterling said softly. "Our 2-pounders are little more than door knockers against them. Our 6-pounders are few and far between. If this tall stranger can actually hit what it aims at, and if it stays running for more than 100 miles without a mechanical heart attack, the men won't care if it's 20 feet tall." A team of American technical liaisons, dressed in their distinct high-collared utility jackets, began to swarm over the tank, shouting instructions in their nasal, rhythmic English. They moved with a hurried, industrial confidence that grated on the British officers' nerves. To the Americans, this was a piece of hardware, a unit of output. To the British, it was the final gamble. 18 of them on this ship alone, the brigadier whispered, more to himself than to Sterling. 300 more on the way. If they are as good as the Yanks say, we might just see the Meredith line by Christmas. If they are rubbish. He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the heat haze blurred the line between the sea and the sky. Sterling climbed onto the hull, his boots leaving dusty prints on the fresh American paint. He gripped the rim of the commander's cupola and peered inside. The interior didn't smell of old oil and damp wool. It smelled of new rubber, fresh wiring, and the strange, sweet scent of American tobacco left behind by a shipyard worker in Pennsylvania. It was the smell of a future that had just arrived in the nick of time. The makeshift command briefing area was a cluster of canvas ridge tents huddled against the limestone cliffs of the Marriott Lagoon. Inside, the air was stagnant, vibrating with the low-frequency hum of 1,000 flies and the distant, rhythmic thud of the port's steam whistles. Maps of the Alamein line, red-penciled arcs of German minefields and the jagged blue lines of British defensive boxes, were pinned to trestle tables that smelled of turpentine and old pine. General Bernard Montgomery entered the tent, not with a stride, but with a brisk, proprietary energy that seemed to vacuum the air out of the room. He was followed by a retinue of senior staff, men with silver hair and ribbons from the Great War, their faces etched with the fatigue of the long retreat from Gazala. In the center of the tent, stripped of its protective cosmoline grease and gleaming under the harsh electric bulb of a portable generator, stood the turret of an M4. It had been delivered ahead of the main column for a technical demonstration. "Well, Alistair," the general snapped, his eyes like two cold flint chips as he circled the steel mass, "I am told the Americans have sent us a savior. Or is it merely a larger target for the 88? Major Sterling stood at attention, his throat dry. "It is the 75mm guns, sir. It is stabilized. The Americans claim their gunners can fire on the move. Not with pinpoint accuracy, perhaps, but enough to keep the Jerry's heads down while we close the distance." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the older officers. General Willoughby stepped forward, poking at the thick rubber seal of the mantlet with his swagger stick. "Stabilized? Preposterous. A tank is a mobile pillbox, Sterling. You stop, you aim, you fire. If you fire while pitching like a trawler in a gale, you'll hit nothing but the Sahara and the clouds." "The Americans call it a gyro stabilizer, General," Sterling countered, his voice steady despite the weight of the room. "And then there is the ammunition. The high-explosive shell contains over 1.5 pounds of TNT. It's twice the weight of what we've been throwing. It will tear the cladding off a Panzer and turn a dug-in Pak 38 into scrap metal." Montgomery stopped his pacing. He climbed onto a wooden crate to peer into the open commander's hatch. The interior was painted a brilliant sanitary white, a stark contrast to the dark, oily bowels of the British Matildas. "The radio is in the turret," Montgomery noted, his voice dropping to a sharp, clinical whisper. "Finally. No more shouting through a tin tube to the driver while the world blows up around you. Communication is the soul of the breakthrough, gentlemen. Without it, we are just sheep in armor." He turned to his chief of staff. "What is the mechanical life of the engine?" An American technical sergeant, standing awkwardly in the corner of the tent, cleared his throat. 500 miles, General. Minimum. The Continental R975 is an aircraft engine. It's built to run at high revolutions for hours. You keep the sand out of the filters, and she'll take you all the way to Tripoli without a hitch." 500 miles, Willoughby scoffed, shaking his head. "Our Crusaders lucky to manage 50 before the fan belts snap or the bearing seize. You're promising us a miracle, Sergeant." "I'm promising you a machine, sir," the American replied, his tone respectful, but devoid of the British deference to rank. "Built in a factory that hasn't seen a bomb in 100 years. We don't repair parts in Detroit, General. We replace them. If a transmission fails, You bolt in a new one in 4 hours and get back to the fight. Montgomery hopped down from the crate, his beret slightly askew. He looked at the maps, then back at the massive cast steel turret. For the first time in months, the lines of his face seemed to relax, if only by a fraction of an inch. "The Germans believe we are beaten," Montgomery said, his voice carrying to every corner of the tent. "They believe the British Tommy is brave but poorly equipped. They expect us to come at them with more of the same, undergun boxes that break down in the heat. They do not expect a vertical jump in technology. They do not expect the industrial might of the New World to be sitting on their doorstep." He tapped a finger on the spot marked Kidney Ridge. "We shall reorganize the 10th Armored. They will be the first to receive these Shermans. We will train the crews until they can operate these machines in their sleep. I want the gunners to know every graduation on those American sites. If this gun can do what Sterling says, we won't just hold the line, we will break it." As the generals began to argue over the logistics of fuel and rubber-padded tracks, Sterling stepped out of the tent into the cooling evening air. The first stars were appearing over the Mediterranean, and down at the docks, the cranes were still moving, silhouetted against the indigo sky. Another ship was coming in, then another. He thought of the British boys out in the dunes, shivering in their blankets, praying that their tanks wouldn't catch fire the moment a German shell glanced off the hull. He looked at his hand, still feeling the smooth, solid curve of the American steel. "The tall strangers," he whispered to the desert wind. "God help the Panzers when these things start to roar." The training grounds at El Alamein were a desolate stretch of flint and soft drift, where the wind whipped the grit into a fine, stinging aerosol that scoured the skin and fouled the spirit. Under the blinding white glare of the midday sun, the first company of the 10th Armored stood before a row of 12 Shermans. To the British troopers, who had spent the last year nursing the temperamental liberty engines of their crusaders like dying relatives, these American machines looked impossibly clean, impossibly sturdy, and, most of all, impossibly large. "Right then, you lot," Sergeant Major Miller bellowed, his face the color of overboiled ham. "This is not a T-wagon. This is the medium tank M4A1. It was built in a place called Ohio by people who have never seen a Messerschmitt, but they know how to bolt steel together. From this moment on, you will treat this machine with more affection than your own mother's." Corporal Arthur Banks, a lean lad from the soot-stained streets of Sheffield, stood at the base of the tank he had been assigned. He looked up at the rounded, cast hull of the tall stranger. His previous mount, a Valentine, had been a cramped, claustrophobic coffin where he sat shoulder to shoulder with his loader, bathed in the stench of burnt oil and spent cordovan. "She's a skyscraper, Artie," his loader, a pale boy named Pip, whispered. "The Jerrys will spot us from Sicily." "Quiet, Pip. Look at the tracks," Banks murmured. The tracks were wide, backed with thick blocks of vulcanized rubber. Unlike the screeching metal-on-metal tracks of the British tanks that announced their presence from miles away, these looked as though they might actually move with a predatory, muffled hum. Banks hauled himself up the side of the hull, his boots gripping the non-slip surface. Another small, thoughtful American detail. He dropped through the commander's hatch into the turret, and for a moment he simply gasped. "Blimey!" Pip's voice echoed from below as he scrambled in after him. "I can breathe! Artie, I can actually stretch my legs!" The interior was a revelation of industrial ergonomics. It was painted a brilliant hospital-grade white, reflecting the desert light that poured through the open hatches. There were padded seats, not wooden benches or bare metal stools, but spring-loaded, adjustable seats covered in heavy canvas. There were storage bins for every tool, racks for the 75mm shells that looked as organized as a chemist's shelf, and a cooling fan that actually whirred when the master switch was thrown. "Look at the radio, Pip," Banks said, pointing to the 19 set mounted in the turret bustle. "No more flags. No more sticking your head out into the lead storm just to tell the troop leader we've thrown a tread." But it was the gun that drew their primary focus. The breech of the 75 was a massive, precision-machined block of steel. Beside it sat the controls for the stabilizer, the mysterious gyro the officers had been whispering about. Banks sat in the gunner's seat. He grasped the dual-handle traverse controls. They moved with a hydraulic silkiness that made the hand-cranked turrets of his youth feel like ancient relics. He pressed his eye to the telescopic sight. The optics were clear, the reticle sharp and unforgiving. "It feels professional," Banks said, his voice dropping. "Like a proper tool for a proper job. Not a lash-up or a compromise." Outside, the American technical liaison, a captain with a drawl as slow as molasses, walked along the line of tanks. He stopped by Banks's turret. "You boys finding everything okay?" the American asked, tilting his cap back. "She's got a bit of a high center of gravity, so don't go taking corners like you're at the Grand Prix. But you treat that engine right, and she'll give you 300 horses of pure Detroit muscle." "Is it true about the Tommy Cook a bit, sir?" Pip asked tentatively, sticking his head out of the loader's hatch. "The Jerrys say the petrol engines catch fire if you so much as sneeze on 'em." The American's face hardened slightly. "Any tank's a furnace if a high-velocity round hits the ammo rack, son. That's why we gave you those big overhead hatches. You get hit, you get out. Fast. But you remember this. You've got a gun that can reach out and touch 'em before they get a bead on you. You hit 'em first, and you won't have to worry about the fire." Banks gripped the controls. The air inside the tank was already heating up, but for the first time since he had arrived in North Africa, the fear that usually sat like a cold stone in his gut felt a little lighter. He looked at the vast, shimmering horizon of the Katara Depression. "Right then," Banks said, flicking the intercom switch. "Driver, start her up. Let's see if this Ohio magic actually works in the sand." The starter motor whined, a high-pitched electrical protest, and then the 9-cylinder radial engine roared into life. It didn't rattle or cough. It settled into a deep, rhythmic thrum that shook the very floor plates. It was the sound of a continent's worth of factories waking up, and as the Sherman lurched forward, biting into the ancient dust, Arthur Banks felt, for the very first time, that he might actually live to see the end of the war. The gunnery range at the edge of the Katara Depression was a shimmering landscape of heat-warped air and white-hot limestone. It was a place where the British Army came to face the brutal truth of its own limitations. On a low ridge, General Montgomery stood with his binoculars pressed to his eyes, flanked by a group of stony-faced brigadiers. They were watching a single M4 Sherman, painted in a disruptive pattern of lightstone and slate, idling 500 yards away. In the valley below, the engineers had constructed a grim gallery of targets. Captured Italian M13 hulls, sandbagged bunkers, and the skeletal remains of a German PaK-38 anti-tank gun. "Begin the run," Montgomery clipped, his voice devoid of emotion. The Sherman didn't just move, it lunged. The 9-cylinder right whirlwind engine gave a guttural, radial growl, the sound of an aircraft forced to crawl. As the tank crested a small dune at 15 miles per hour, the long barrel of the 75mm gun did something that made the gathered officers lean forward in unison. It stayed level. While the hull pitched and rolled over the uneven limestone, the muzzle remained fixed on the horizon, as if held by an invisible hand. "The stabilizer, sir," Major Sterling whispered, unable to hide the pride in his voice. "It's fighting the terrain." Inside the turret, Corporal Arthur Banks was sweating through his shirt. "Target! Anti-tank gun! 12 o'clock! 800 yards!" he shouted over the intercom. He didn't have to wait for the tank to come to a grinding halt, throwing up a telltale cloud of dust for the enemy to range on. He adjusted the fine-tuning knobs, the hydraulic traverse whirring with a surgical hum. The crosshairs of the American M38 telescope settled on the German gun shield. "Fire!" The tank rocked back on its springs. A massive plume of orange flame and gray smoke erupted from the muzzle. Unlike the sharp, high-pitched crack of the British 2-pounder, the Sherman spoke with a deep, chest-thumping boom that echoed off the cliffs. A second later, the target area vanished in a spectacular geyser of black smoke and jagged metal. The 6-pound high-explosive shell had struck the German position directly. When the dust cleared, The anti-tank gun was a twisted wreck. Its crew, represented by wooden mannequins, scattered like matchsticks. "Good God," Willoughby muttered, lowering his glasses. "That wasn't a piercing shot. That was an execution." "That is the difference, General," Sterling said, turning to his superior. "Our tanks have spent the last year trying to snipe the enemy with solid steel slugs. We hit the tank, but we can't touch the men in the trenches. This American shell has enough burst to clear a path for the infantry. It's not just a tank killer, it's a formation breaker." Montgomery didn't look away from the range. "Again, while moving, I want to see the limits of that gyro." Banks obliged. The Sherman accelerated, its wide tracks churning the desert floor into a wake of dust. 3 times the gun spoke, and 3 times the valley erupted. The accuracy wasn't perfect. The stabilizer was a temperamental beast that required a skilled hand. No, it was enough. It was more than enough. "It's the rate of fire," one of the colonels remarked, checking his pocket watch. "He's putting a shell down range every 7 seconds. The breech block drops open automatically after the shot. The loader just has to shove the next one in. It's industrial slaughter." As the Sherman finished its run and clattered toward the observation ridge, the silence among the high command was heavy with a mix of relief and a strange, lingering shame. For 2 years, they had sent men into battle in machines that were outclassed and outgunned. They had relied on mucking through and British grit. Now, standing before them was a machine that didn't care about grit. It cared about foot-pounds of energy, cubic centimeters of displacement, and the terrifying efficiency of the American assembly line. The Sherman ground to a halt at the foot of the ridge. Banks popped the commander's hatch, his face smeared with grease and soot, but his eyes were wide with a frantic, newfound energy. He looked up at the generals and, breaking all protocol, gave a sharp thumbs up. Montgomery turned to his staff, his face a mask of cold calculation. "I want every man in the 8th Army to see this," he ordered. "I want the rumors to spread. I want the Jerrys to hear that we have a gun that doesn't miss and a tank that doesn't stop. We have spent enough time being the anvil, gentlemen. It is time for the British Army to become the hammer." He looked at the Sherman, the tall stranger that now smelled of cordite and success. "We start the offensive in October, and these American Shermans will lead the way." The war room at 8th Army headquarters was not a room at all, but a cavernous, double-walled tent buried beneath camouflage netting and the cooling shadows of a limestone ridge. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of paraffin lamps and the dry, metallic tang of radio static. General Bernard Montgomery sat at a long trestle table, his sharp features illuminated by a single electric bulb that swayed gently in the desert draft. Before him lay the map of the Devil's Gardens, the hellish tapestry of several 100,000 German and Italian mines that stood between the British and the open road to Tripoli. "The plan remains the same, gentlemen," Montgomery said, his voice a dry, rhythmic rasp. "Operation Lightfoot. We break the crust, we clear the lanes, and then we unleash the armor. But the armor must be something the Desert Fox has never seen." He tapped a wooden pointer against a cluster of blue icons near the northern sector of the line. "The 10th Armored Division. They are our iron fist. They carry the weight of 300 of these American M4s. I want them concentrated. I want them used as a battering ram, not a screen. We are going to drive through the center of their line like a hot wire through wax." A brigadier with a scarred cheek leaned forward into the light. "Sir, the intelligence reports suggest Rommel has moved his 15th Panzer to meet us. They have the special Mark IVs now, the long 75mm guns. They can punch through our Crusaders before our boys even see the muzzle flash." "That is precisely why the Sherman is the key," Montgomery countered, his eyes snapping to the officer. "For 2 years, we have played a game of cat and mouse where the mouse had no teeth. Now, the cat is about to meet something with a bigger bite. I've seen the ballistic reports. The American gun can match the German long 75, yard for yard. And more importantly, the American tank will still be moving when the German is out of fuel and spare parts." The debate shifted to the creeping barrage, the massive artillery coordination that would precede the tanks. Montgomery was insistent. The Shermans were not to wait for the infantry to clear every pocket of resistance. They were to use their speed and their high explosive shells to suppress the enemy as they moved. "It is a shift in doctrine," Major Sterling noted from the edge of the table. "We are moving away from the cavalry mindset of the dash and the raid. This is a war of attrition, of industrial weight. The Sherman is the physical manifestation of that weight." Montgomery nodded slowly. "Precisely. Rommel is a genius of the maneuver, of the sudden flank. But genius cannot manufacture steel in the middle of a desert. We have the factories of Detroit behind us now. Every Sherman we lose can be replaced by 2 more within a fortnight. Rommel has only what he can scavenge from the bottom of the Mediterranean." As the senior officers began to coordinate the complex timings of the assault, Sterling slipped out of the tent. The desert night had descended, turning the sand into a sea of silver and charcoal. The temperature had plummeted, and a biting wind whined through the guy ropes. In the distance, he could see the faint, shielded glows of 1,000 hooded lanterns. The 8th Army was breathing, a massive, mechanical beast, preparing for its leap. He walked toward the vehicle park of the 10th Armored, where the Shermans sat in long, silent rows. They looked different in the moonlight. The high, rounded hulls seemed less like skyscrapers and more like ancient, humped boulders. British crews were sleeping beneath the hulls, wrapped in their wool blankets, seeking the last bits of warmth radiating from the cooling engines. Sterling stopped by a tank named Fearless. A young subaltern was sitting on the front glacis, staring at a small photograph by the light of a dimmed torch. "Tense night, Lieutenant?" Sterling asked softly. The boy jumped slightly, then saluted. "Just checking the sights one last time, sir. The Americans told us these gyros can be finicky if the oil gets too cold." "They are more than machines, son," Sterling said, looking at the long, dark barrel pointed toward the German lines. "They are the first real hope this army has had in 3 years. Sleep while you can. Tomorrow, you're going to make history." The lieutenant looked at the tank, then back at the dark horizon where the German Panzers lay waiting. "I hope the Americans were telling the truth, sir. I really do." Sterling walked away, the crunch of his boots the only sound in the vast, expectant silence. The shadow of the desert fox loomed large over the dunes, but for the first time, the British felt they were no longer hunted. They were the hunters. The night before the offensive, the moon hung over the Alamein line like a cold silver coin, illuminating a desert that had been transformed into the largest garage in human history. Under the vast, indifferent canopy of the Egyptian sky, the 10th Armored was a hive of muffled clashing and whispered curses. This was the invisible war, the war of the grease gun, the torque wrench, and the high-octane fuel tin. Corporal Arthur Banks lay on his back beneath the belly of his M4, his hands slick with a mixture of graphite lubricant and the fine, pervasive dust that turned everything into sandpaper. Above him, the massive transmission housing of the Sherman loomed like the hull of a ship. "Pass me the 15/16, Pip," Banks grunted, his voice echoing against the steel. "The vibration from the march up has loosened the housing bolts on the final drive. If we leak oil in the middle of a minefield, we're a dead loss." Pip, his face unrecognizable under a mask of black oil, handed over the heavy American wrench. "The Yanks don't half use strange sizes, Artie. Everything's in inches and fractions. My old man's tools from the mill back home won't fit a single nut on this beast." "It's a different world, Pip," Banks said, straining as he tightened a bolt. "Back in Sheffield, we'd spend a week hand-filing a bracket to fit a Valentine. Here, everything is exactly the same. I saw the American liaison swap out a whole generator today in 20 minutes. He didn't even look at the manual. Just unbolted the old, dropped in the new. It's unsettling in a way. Like the machine doesn't have a soul, just a set of instructions." Beside their tank, a small fire flickered in a Benghazi burner, an old biscuit tin filled with sand and petrol. A group of troopers huddled around it, the blue flames casting long dancing shadows against the olive-drab armor. They weren't talking about the coming battle. They were comparing the amenities of their new American homes. "The seats, lads," one sergeant was saying, his voice thick with a London accent. "They've got springs! Actual honest-to-God springs. I've spent 2 years having my spine hammered into my skull by the floor plates of a Matilda. Now I feel like I'm riding in a ruddy limousine." "And the heater," another added, rubbing his chilled hands. "The Americans actually thought about the fact that the desert gets cold at night. There's a duct that bleeds warmth from the engine into the fighting compartment. It's like they expect us to be comfortable while we're being shot at." Banks slid out from under the tank, wiping his hands on a rag that was already saturated with grime. He stood up and looked down the long line of Shermans. In the moonlight, they looked like a silent, prehistoric herd. For the first time, he felt a strange sort of kinship with the machine. It wasn't the temperamental, fragile relationship he'd had with British tanks, which felt like they were constantly looking for an excuse to fail. The Sherman felt reliable. It felt like a promise kept by a friend who lived 3,000 miles away. A shadow fell over the fire. It was the American technical officer, Captain Miller. He was carrying a crate of small, waxed cardboard boxes. "Evening, fellas," Miller said, dropping the crate. "K-rations. Thought you might want something better than that bully beef before the balloon goes up tomorrow. There's chocolate in there, and cigarettes that don't taste like burning hay." Banks took a pack of the rations, the colorful American printing looking garish and bright in the dim light. "Thank you, Captain. Tell me, back in Detroit or wherever they make these, do they know? Do they know where these tanks are going?" Miller looked at the row of M4s, his expression unreadable. "My brother works the line at the Fisher Body Plant in Flint. He spends 10 hours a day welding turrets. He doesn't know about Alamein, or the Devil's Gardens, or Rommel. But he knows that if he misses a single weld, someone like you doesn't come home. So yeah, Corporal, they know. They're working 3 shifts a day to make sure you've got more steel than the other guy." Banks nodded slowly, looking at the tall stranger that was now his world. He thought of the thousands of men and women in factories across the Atlantic, people he would never meet, who were essentially fighting this battle alongside him with every bolt they tightened. "Right then," Banks said, tossing the oily rag aside. "Pip, get some sleep. We move out at 2200 tomorrow. The barrage starts then. And I want this engine purring like a kitten when the sky turns red." As the camp settled into a tense, final silence, the only sound was the clicking of cooling metal and the distant, rhythmic thud of a single German Spandau machine gun miles away, firing fruitlessly into the dark. The Iron Fist was ready. The American inheritance was about to be claimed in fire. The night of October 23rd did not begin with a whisper, but with a roar that seemed to tear the very fabric of the celestial firmament. At 2140 hours, nearly 1,000 British guns spoke as one. The horizon to the east vanished, replaced by a continuous, flickering wall of orange and strobe white fire. The air, once cold and still, became a physical thing, vibrating with a concussive force that rattled the teeth in the skulls of every man waiting in the dunes. Inside the belly of his M4, Corporal Arthur Banks felt the vibration not through the air, but through the steel hull. It felt as though the earth itself were being pulverized. "Driver, start up!" Banks bellowed into the intercom. The right whirlwind radial engine coughed once, spitting a plume of blue exhaust into the sulphurous night, and then settled into its high-pitched aeronautical whine. Around them, the rest of the Iron Fist, the Shermans of the 10th Armored, began to churn the desert into a fog of grit and diesel smoke. "Lamps on! Follow the white tape!" The advance was agonizingly slow. The Shermans were funneled into narrow lanes cleared by the sappers, the engineers who moved on their hands and knees ahead of the steel, feeling for the cold, metallic edges of German teller mines. To the left and right, the Devil's Gardens remained, a lethal tapestry of explosives, waiting for a single stray track. "Keep her steady, Collins," Banks urged his driver. 1 foot off the tape and we're a stationary coffin. The silhouette of the Sherman, so often criticized for its height, now felt like a towering fortress. Through the episcope, Banks watched the eerie landscape. The British barrage was lifting, moving forward in its creeping rhythm, leaving behind a landscape of shattered limestone and burning German supply trucks. Suddenly, the world turned into a kaleidoscope of tracers. The German 88 anti-tank guns, hidden in the reverse slopes of Kidney Ridge, had found their range. Clang! A solid shot struck the crest of a dune just yards away, showering the Sherman in a rain of molten flint. "Target! Anti-tank flash! 11 o'clock!" Banks screamed. He didn't have to wait for the tank to stop. He gripped the Cadillac hydraulic controls, and the stabilizer fought the pitching of the hull. The crosshairs danced, then locked onto a flicker of muzzle flash in the dark. "High explosive! Fire!" The Sherman rocked. The 75mm gun barked, and for the first time in combat, Banks saw the devastating American gift in action. The shell didn't just pierce, it detonated. A massive pillar of black smoke and flame erupted where the German gun had been. Through the optics, Banks saw the German crew catapulted into the air like rag dolls. "Direct hit! Move us up, Collins! Don't let them find our rhythm!" But the Gardens were not so easily conquered. To their right, a Sherman named Indomitable strayed mere inches from the cleared path. There was a dull, subterranean thump, and the massive tank was lifted bodily into the air. The right track was shredded instantly, the heavy steel links flailing like a broken whip. "They're out! They're getting out!" Pip yelled from the loader's position. Banks watched through his periscope. In a British Valentine, a mine strike often meant the crew was trapped in a crumpled box of fire. But here, the wide American hatches flipped open with mechanical ease. Within seconds, the 5-man crew had tumbled out, shaken but alive, sprinting for the cover of a nearby shell scrape. "The hatches, Pip! Did you see that?" Banks shouted over the roar of the engine. "They made it!" The advance continued into the teeth of the German defense. The air was now a thick, choking fog of cordite and pulverized stone. The Shermans moved forward, their tall silhouettes flickering in the light of the burning reeks. They were no longer tall strangers or American gifts. They were the leading edge of a new world's fury, an industrial tide that refused to be stemmed by the mines or the guns of the Desert Fox. "The ridge is coming up, lads!" Banks cried out, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and triumph. "Hold on to your hats! We're going through!" As the first light of dawn began to bleed into the eastern sky, the Shermans crested the rise, their long shadows stretching out toward the retreating Panzers. The iron fist had broken the crust. The morning of October 24th broke, not with the gentle clarity of a desert dawn, but through a jaundiced filter of suspended limestone and the oily, black soot of burning grease. As the sun crested the horizon, it revealed the carnage of Kidney Ridge, a landscape transformed into a graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. "Commander! Panzers! 11 o'clock! 1,500 yards!" Collins's voice crackled through the intercom, sharp with the primal edge of a man who had seen too many of his friends vanish in a flash of steel. Corporal Arthur Banks pressed his face against the rubber brow pad of the M38 telescope. The magnification brought the nightmare into focus. Emerging from the shimmering heat haze of the western dunes were the silhouettes of the Panzer IV Specials. They were lean, lethal machines, their long 75mm KWK-40 guns protruding like the stings of giant iron wasps. "They've spotted us, Artie!" Pip yelled, shoving a brass-cased, armor-piercing shell into the breach. The heavy block slammed shut with a metallic clack that sounded like the cocking of a giant rifle. "Load! AP! Up!" "Steady, Collins," Banks whispered, his hands trembling slightly on the hydraulic controls. "Short halts only. Don't let them bracket us." The duel began at a distance that would have been suicide for a British 2-pounder. A German muzzle flash, a sharp, violent tongue of orange flame, bloomed in the distance. A split second later, a solid shot shrieked over the Sherman's turret with the sound of a tearing silk sheet. "Range 1,200!" Banks adjusted the elevation. The Sherman stabilizer hummed, a low, defiant vibration beneath his seat, keeping the reticle steady even as the tank loped over the uneven ground. "On target! Fire!" The Sherman bucked, the interior filled with the sharp ozone tang of cordite and the clatter of the empty brass casing hitting the floor plates. Through the optics, Banks watched the tracer, a tiny glowing spark, streak across the valley. It struck the leading Panzer's turret ring. A shower of sparks, like a blacksmith's anvil being struck, erupted from the German tank. "Hit! But she's still moving!" The German commander was a veteran of the Russian steppes and the French plains. He swung his Panzer into a hull-down position behind a low ridge, his long guns searching for the high silhouette of the American intruder. Crack! Boom! The Sherman shuddered as if hit by a giant sledgehammer. A German shell had clipped the sandbagged armor on the front glacis, spinning off into the sky. Inside, the crew was deafened by the bell-like ring of the impact. "We're hit! We're hit!" Pip screamed, his eyes wide in the dim white light of the fighting compartment. "Check the dials! Are we burning?" Banks shouted. "Oil pressure's fine! No smoke!" Collins called back, his voice strained. "She's still purring, Artie." Banks felt a surge of cold, hard adrenaline. In a Crusader, that hit would have shattered the thin armor and sent white-hot spall whistling through the crew's lungs. But the thick American cast steel had held. "Move us left! Flank him!" The Sherman surged forward. Its 300-horsepower engine roared with a mechanical ferocity that the lighter German tanks couldn't match in the soft sand. As they crested a small rise, the Panzer IV was momentarily exposed. "Now! Halt!" The Sherman lurched to a stop. Banks didn't wait for the suspension to settle. He trusted the American optics. He aimed for the thin vertical plate of the German hull. "Fire!" This time, there were no sparks. The American armor-piercing capped shell punched through the German steel with a sickening, muffled thud. A moment later, a pillar of white-hot flame erupted from the Panzer's hatches as its own ammunition ignited. The turret was lifted inches off the hull before settling back down in a shroud of oily smoke. "Direct hit! Scratch 1 Mark IV!" Pip cheered, already reaching for the next round. Across the ridge, the scene was being repeated. The Shermans were not just surviving, they were dominating. British generals, watching through high-powered binoculars from their scout cars, saw a sight they had waited 3 years to witness. German panzers retreating in the face of superior firepower. The tall strangers were proving their worth in the most brutal currency of war. They moved with a reliability that mocked the desert, and they struck with a violence that silenced the vaunted German anti-tank screens. As the sun reached its zenith, the valley was a charnel house of burning panzers. Arthur Banks wiped the sweat and grease from his forehead, his heart hammering against his ribs. He looked at the controls of his tank, the American gift that had just saved his life. "God bless the Yanks," he whispered into the smoke-filled air. "God bless every single one of them." The guns fell silent at last, leaving a ringing, hollow void that felt heavier than the barrage itself. By the afternoon of November 4th, the desert was no longer a battlefield. It was a smoking ledger of imperial ambitions. The Iron Fist had punched through the final German rearguard at the Rommel track, and now the remnants of the Afrika Korps were a ragged line of dust clouds vanishing toward the Libyan border. General Montgomery's staff car, a dusty, open-topped Humber, crunched over the gravel of Kidney Ridge. Beside him sat Major Sterling, his face masked by a week's growth of beard and a layer of fine, white limestone dust. They stopped at the crest of a rise overlooking a shallow wadi littered with the charred carcasses of the great duel. "Look at them, Alistair," Montgomery said, gesturing with his leather-bound binoculars toward a cluster of knocked-out M4s. "They fought like lions, but more importantly, they stayed in the fight." They stepped out of the car, their boots crunching on jagged shards of shrapnel and spent brass casings. A technical recovery team from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers was already at work, swarming over a Sherman named Dreadnought. The tank had taken a direct hit from a German 88 in the side hull. "Status, Colonel?" Montgomery snapped at the senior engineer. The colonel looked up, wiping a smear of black grease across his forehead. It's a miracle of modularity, sir. The shell breached the sponson and started a small fire in the auxiliary generator. In a Crusader, the fuel lines would have vaporized and cooked the lot of them. But here, he pointed to the thick internal firewalls and the wide escape hatches. The crew got out in under 10 seconds. We've already towed her back, swapped the generator for a spare from a wrecked unit, and patched the plate. She'll be back in the line by 1800 hours today. Sterling walked to the side of the tank, touching the jagged, petal-shaped hole where the German steel had bitten into the American cast armor. Reliability is the greatest weapon we've been given, sir. We lost nearly half our strength in the first 48 hours, but by the third day, we had 75% of those machines back in action. The Germans, once their Panzers are hit, they stay hit. They don't have the parts. They don't have the standardization. They moved further down the ridge, where a group of British tank commanders stood in a circle, sharing a tin of American Lucky Strike cigarettes. Among them was Corporal Arthur Banks. His uniform was shredded at the elbows and his eyes were bloodshot, but he stood with a new, quiet confidence. "General on deck!" Banks called out, snapping a weary but sharp salute. Montgomery walked up to the corporal, his eyes scanning the man's soot-stained face. "You were in the thick of it at the Depression, weren't you, lad?" "Yes, sir. 3rd Troop, C Squadron. We took on 4 Mark IVs at point-blank range, sir." "And the machine? Tell me the truth. Is she too tall for the desert?" Banks looked back at his Sherman, which was currently being refueled from a line of American-built Bedford trucks. "She's a tall lady, sir, no doubt, but she's got a heart of iron. We took 3 hits that would have turned a Valentine into a colander. We're still here, and that gun? It's the first time we felt like we could actually reach out and break the Jerry's backs." Montgomery turned to Sterling, a rare, thin smile touching his lips. "There is our verdict, Alistair. The tall stranger is a stranger no more. She is a member of the 8th Army." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the graveyard of Panzers, Sterling pulled a notebook from his pocket. He began to draft the final dispatch to the War Office in London. "The American medium tank M4 has redefined the mechanical endurance of the armored division," he wrote. "It has proven that industrial volume and standardized engineering are the true masters of the modern battlefield. Without the Sherman, the breakthrough at El Alamein would have been a bloody stalemate. With it, it is a pursuit." He looked out over the vast, open desert. The war was far from over. There was still Tripoli, Tunisia, and eventually the soft underbelly of Europe. But as the Shermans roared into life once more, their radial engines singing a mechanical chorus of defiance, Sterling knew that the tide had not just turned, it had become a flood. The twilight over the Egyptian desert turned the sky into a bruised palette of violet and deep indigo. In the officers' mess of the 10th Armored, a collection of sandbag dugouts covered by oil-stained canvas, the air was thick with the scent of Victory cigarettes and the rare, sharp aroma of real Highland whiskey, uncorked to mark the breakthrough. Major Sterling sat at a small folding desk, the yellow light of a hurricane lamp flickering across the official sitrep, the situation report, that would soon be encrypted and flashed across the cables to London and Washington. 24th of October to the 4th of November, Sterling whispered, his pen hovering over the paper. 12 days that changed the world, and we did it on American tracks. General Willoughby entered the tent, his swagger stick tucked under his arm. He looked older, the lines around his eyes etched deep by the strain of the cauldron at Kidney Ridge. But the skepticism that had clouded his face at the Alexandria docks was gone. He poured himself a finger of whiskey and sat opposite Sterling. "I've just come from the forward repair shops, Alistair," Willoughby said, his voice unusually quiet. "Do you know what the engineers are calling the M4 now? They stopped calling it the Tall Stranger. They're calling it the Ironsides. Because no matter how many times the Jerry's hit the hull, the bloody thing just refuses to die." Sterling nodded, his pen scratching against the parchment. "It's the psychological weight, General. I spoke with a captured Oberleutnant from the 15th Panzer an hour ago. He was shaking. He said they knocked out the same Sherman 3 times in 2 days, and each morning it reappeared on the ridgeline, patched and firing. He called it industrial witchcraft. "It isn't witchcraft," Willoughby countered, staring into his glass. "It's a different philosophy of war. We British, we build tanks like we build watches. Exquisite, temperamental, and unique. The Americans build them like they build shovels. Robust, interchangeable, and endless. They didn't just send us a tank. They sent us a factory wrapped in steel." Outside the tent, the rhythmic, heavy thrum of a passing column of Shermans shook the ground. The sound was constant now, a mechanical heartbeat that didn't falter. For the first time since 1939, the British Army wasn't worried about spare parts or seized engines. They were worried about how fast they could chase the enemy. Sterling looked at his final paragraph. "The conclusion of the 8th Army High Command is absolute," he wrote, his handwriting firm and clear. "The medium tank M4, henceforth referred to by the British designation Sherman, has provided the decisive margin of superiority. Its 75mm gun has ended the reign of the German anti-tank screen, and its mechanical reliability has allowed us to maintain a pursuit of over 100 miles without a single operational failure in the lead elements. We owe our presence on the road to Benghazi to the workers of Detroit." He blotted the ink and looked up at Willoughby. "Will you sign it, sir, as the official verdict for the War Cabinet?" Willoughby took the pen. He didn't hesitate. "I'll do more than sign it. I'll attach a personal note to the Prime Minister. I'll tell him that if he wants to win this war, he should stop building cruisers and start ordering Shermans by the thousand. We found our hammer, Alistair. Now we just have to keep swinging it until the Reich cracks." As the general left the tent, Sterling walked to the entrance and looked out toward the west. Far out in the dunes, the taillights of the retreating German army were tiny, dying embers. In the foreground, silhouetted against the rising moon, stood a lone Sherman. Its crew, Corporal Banks and young Pip, were sitting on the turret, silhouetted in the silver light. They were laughing, the sound carrying easily over the cooling desert floor. They were alive. They were winning. And they were riding on 3,000 miles of American promise. Sterling looked at the stars, the same stars that were currently shining over the quiet factories in Ohio and the bustling docks of New Jersey. "Thank you," he whispered to the night air, a salute to a nation he had never seen, but whose strength he now held in his hand. "Thank you for the gift." The tall strangers were strangers no more. They were the liberators of Africa, and they were just getting started.